Well, good evening, everyone. If you're in the States and if you're like our dear brother, Tim Steadman, if you're in Australia, then good morning and welcome to our sequel, which I did with Tim from a few weeks ago when we talked about the Nephilim or the giants. And today I wanted to have Tim back again because I think we were all blessed by having Tim last time, and when he was sharing all his experience and knowledge about this topic. Tim, welcome again. Thank you so much for finding time for us.
Well, g'day, and thank you very much for another opportunity to come back on your show. I really enjoyed it last time. Had a great time. Was looking forward to doing it again, and yeah, it's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you kindly. Tim, before we continue where we left off last time, can you please give us a brief introduction or reintroduction about something, spiritual, theological background, and what made you research about this topic of the Nephilim?
Oh, sure, yeah. So, yeah, for those who didn't catch us last time, uh, my name's Tim Steadman. I am well. Let's be frank. I'm an amateur researcher and author. I won't claim to be credentialed or anything. I'm not an academic, but I spend a lot of my time in academic material. And I've been a Christian over 30 years. I got interested in this topic of the Nephilim as I was struggling to come to terms with the idea of what kind of God would do this to people in the flood, where, he saves a handful of people and the rest of them will die. How does that work? And eventually I realized that the interpretive key for that narrative was hidden behind that word Nephilim, which occurs in Genesis 6. And that just sent me down a long rabbit trail of study, which opened up a world of great scholarship and insights from all over the place. Really helped me to understand that better and to reconcile the understanding of God that I had, that our God is a God of love and grace and mercy. And that even shows in the Old Testament. We don't have two separate gods, the angry Old Testament God and the kind and warm, fuzzy, loving New Testament God. So, yeah, it was a really worthwhile study to get into. I've learned so much in it's been over 15 years that I've been diving deep into this stuff, and I continue to do that. I've got my own podcast as well, which you can follow, called Answers to Giant Questions. It's named after my book, which is also Answers to Giant Questions. And the book was a in-depth discovery or exploration, if you like, of the Nephilim, kind of like a systematic theology. I had someone compare it to a systematic theology of the biblical giants. So if that's your thing, then yeah, the book's a great resource for that. The podcast has a slightly different focus because I'm exploring the primeval history, that is chapters 1 through 11 of the book of Genesis, and getting deep into the context that produced that and how that helps us to understand everything else in the Bible.
Yeah, I always like when people give context and the background like you just did because it helps us understand what was your motive, what was your passion. And for you, I think it's such an honest attitude that you had and that you're willing to share with us because um maybe it caused you to doubt, maybe it caused you to have certain unpleasant questions that may not be welcome in in a in a global church, let's put it that way. But for you, this honest question that bothered you, you went and actually investigate about that instead of just deconstructing your faith and maybe saying how this is all garbage or how Jesus is not the Lord and just leave. So, I salute you for that. I would just summarize quickly the last episode for all of you guys who didn't watch the last episode with Tim. I would strongly encourage you to do so because you can learn a lot from our brother. I would also encourage you to support him and buy his book, which I am posting links for his Amazon book again. So we talked last time about who were the Nephilim. We gave some extra biblical and biblical sources. We covered Jewish tradition, church fathers. We talked about how is it possible that Nephilim reappeared after the flood. We mentioned so many different views. Then we went to mention different clans of the giants, being one of them is Amorites, Rephaim, Amalekites, and then we mentioned Leviathan. We said, okay, that's enough for today. Let's continue next time. And it is my fault completely that even though I thought we'll be done today, but I keep finding so much sources, so much information, and I wrote a really detailed, long, new outline for Tim last night. And when I sent it, we were like, both of us, oh yeah, we may not finish tonight, which is, I think, okay, because there can always be next time. So for tonight, Tim and I wanted to start talking about certain individuals who may agree or disagree with our view or with Tim's view, with Tim's book. And that's completely fine if someone disagrees, because from all these disagreements, if people have good arguments, solid arguments, and if they learn how to attack the argument instead of attacking the person, this is how iron sharpens the iron, and we can learn from everybody. So, Tim, I wanted to start tonight with Dr. John Reeves, who is a professor of Judaic studies and professor of religious studies. One of the things that he says is that in Deuteronomy 2, 10 to 11, the Anakim are linked with the Rephaim, which is a term with linguistic and thematic connections to the ancient Canaanite royal funerary cult. Moreover, the Book of Jubilees flatly states that the Rephaim were giants in Jubilee 29:9. So, what can we say about the connection between Anakim, Rephaim, and this royal funerary cult?
Yeah, I would definitely agree with John there. We sort of have a couple of different streams of tradition that connect to the Rephaim. It's a very complex uh, matrix of ideas that comes together in that term. You've got to pull together a whole lot of different ideas to get a comprehensive picture of who the Rephaim were and what they represented in the minds of biblical authors. So, on the one hand, the Rephaim are referred to as the ancient kings who passed away. You'll find that in Isaiah, in that passage describing the fall of Satan. The lead up to that famous passage where it mentions the you know the fall of Lucifer. You have the Rephaim rising up to greet the devil as he's cast down, and it's the idea that these are these are bad guys. Uh, their bodies are dead. They live in Sheol, and they are some nasty guys, right? But there's also this idea that they've been disempowered. They are weak now. They don't have uh, a physical embodiment. They've got no strength, and these are the dead kings from the past. Okay, so now we go back to the conquest narrative, and we have all these tribes which have various names, as you say, the Rephaim, the Anakim. A lot of these terms overlap, and there are some fine distinctions, a bit of nuance there as to how you sort of put them together. But the literary connection, or shall we say the linguistic connection between the Rephaim and this idea of uh, kingship and royalty and whatnot, that is an unbroken chain from as far back as we go in human civilization. Uh, and Dr. Judd Burton's done some really great work on this. I mean, he's the real expert on that. If you want to get him on the show, he's actually quite accessible. And yeah, even that term royalty, as I said, that term itself has a linguistic connection right back to Rephaim. That letter R at the start there, that isn't just a coincidence. That carries through every language group, tracing right back to that ancient time, right? So the idea of kingship and authority over nations and people groups goes right back to the Rephaim and beyond. Now, the Bible talks about these guys as these cruel tyrants, really nasty, and even in the afterlife, you don't want to be where they are. So it was the hope of the ancient Israelite that they would not remain forever in Sheol after death. And for that we've got Jesus to thank. But back then, of course, they're anticipating this, and all they could do was hope that they wouldn't have to be in Sheol with the Rephaim forever. So these guys were scary, right? And so in uh, in ancient traditions about the Rephaim and certain members of the Rephaim, you know about King Og of Bashan. We're going to talk about him a bit more later. They've found inscriptions that this guy is going to avenge the dead. You don't want to disturb somebody's grave because he's going to come and avenge the person who disturbs the bones of the person buried there. Like, that kind of stuff is freaky, right? So yeah, the Rephaim were not to be trifled with.
Yeah, thanks for that. I have another quote by Dr. Reeves, and it's a little bit long one, so I'll just read it. He said that traditions such as Targum, Pseudo Jonathan, Deuteronomy 3:11, which I'll read very soon, affect an equation between King Og's Rephaim and the giants of antediluvian lore, and explain that King Og was the sole survivor of the giants who perished in the waters of the flood during the time of Noah. Now, Targum Pseudo Jonathan is a Western Targum or translation of the Torah, so the first 5 books of the Old Testament, from the land of Israel. It was composed in Israel between 150 and 250 of Common Era. And this is the quotation that actually comes from Targum Jonathan on Deuteronomy 3:11. It says, "For only Og, king of Methnan, or Matnan, I don't know how to pronounce this guy's name. Would you know how to pronounce it?
It's a transliteration. I think it's jumped through a few languages. Originally, you had Bashan.
Okay.
They will have picked up on the Aramaic in Babylon, possibly through having read stuff even in cuneiform, actually. So yeah, there's going to be a whole bunch of reasons why that doesn't come out as a straight one-to-one
Yeah.
correspondence.
Yeah, thanks for that. So it says, "For only O king of Methnan remained of the remnant of the giants who perished in the deluge. Behold, his bedstead was a bedstead of iron. Behold, it is placed in the archive house in Rabath, of the Beni Ammon, 9 cubits in its length, 4 cubits its breadth, in the cubit of its own stature." So once first we hear what Targum Jonathan says when it comes to Deuteronomy 3:11, and then we see someone who is credible like Dr. John Reeves and who speaks about King Og being mentioned as Rephaim and all these things as the context. How is this helping? I don't know if I can say our case, but also helping the material that we are learning from your book.
It's an interesting one. The Targum's interesting because they take these biblical stories and expand on them and explore them. With these kind of things, there's always a bit of a blur between the historicity of these expansions and the didactic purpose of the text, right? So, in other words, they're expanding on the literature for teaching purposes rather than adding extra historical detail. It's true that there was a tradition that Og of Bashan was one of the original giants from before the flood. That probably derives from the expression last of the Rephaim. And it shows that there is a definite connection between the Nephilim and the Rephaim because the word Nephilim is not used in Deuteronomy, nor is Rephaim used in Genesis 6. That idea of identifying the same group with different names proves that in the mind of ancient scribes, there was a definite connection, and it was assumed that the same group was being referred to. You don't necessarily have that concrete textual link. It's a thematic connection, and it exists in the minds of the audience because they know these stories. Now, the Targum expands on the material from Deuteronomy in telling us that Og had a physical size proportionate to the bed that's described in Deuteronomy. You don't get that from the text of the Bible, but you do get that if you consider that he was known as a giant, so it follows logically. But I should point out that the dimensions given for the bed were not intended to convey any particular messaging about the physical size of Og of Bashan. The dimensions of that bed actually correspond to another bed used in cultic ritual, which was described in a text uncovered from ancient Mesopotamia, known as the Isa Gila tablet. And I'll give you a short quote from my book, actually, because I talk about this. This is just a brief quote from the book, and the purpose of that bed. All right, so here's the quote. This is particularly in the context of ritual lovemaking, where the bed is decorated and adorned with flowers, spices, and fragrances. The biblical use of this term describes the beloved in the Song of Solomon 5, verse 13. Taking this usage of the word tower, we can also see a correlation to the pagan use of ritual lovemaking beds. These were found in temples where the royalty used them for the purpose of interacting with the deities. This interaction was achieved by a temple prostitute, literally a living idol. The most famous of these beds is that of Marduk of Babylon, described in line 34 of the ancient Isa Gila tablet from Mesopotamia as being 9 cubits in length and 4 cubits wide, or roughly 13.5 feet by 6 feet. That's a big bed. Now, that's the end of the quote. So the idea behind mentioning the bed isn't anything to do with the size of the thing, but it was everything to do with the kind of rituals that the king was involved with, and these are connected in the Jewish mind to the origin of the giants, in particular the post-flood giants. So yeah, that's what the bed's about. A lot of people just sort of jump to, well, he needed a big bed because he was a big guy. But specifically, we've got a textual connection to the ritual practices of the Mesopotamians. This was introduced to Babylon by the Amorites, and of course, Og of Bashan and all his ilk fall into the broad category of Amorites in and around the land of Canaan. So that's where the connection lays. So the idea of Moses mentioning the size of the bed in Deuteronomy is to bring it back to that idea of, this is the bad stuff that the Amorites introduced to Babylon, and which from there proliferated back through Canaan and the surrounds, with the result that we had these pockets of giant clans coming up all through the hill country outside Israel and along the northern border of Israel as well.
As much as I love all these amazing stories and fables and, including giants, I think it would not be fair. It would be even less academic and scholarly if we would assume just because the bed was huge that was inevitably the size of King Og. Because I remember at one point of my life, I was single and still sleeping in king size bed. Now that bed was like could fit 4 people like me. Imagine if someone would come and not see me, but come in my apartment and see the bed.
Yeah.
It's so easy to assume, oh, this guy who lives here must be huge.
Yeah.
And I'm not, right? So I'm just trying to make those fair parallels and trying to be intellectually honest, even though I would love that to be a solid evidence that King Og was a giant. Like you said, that's not necessarily true, because the size of his bed doesn't necessarily mean that he was, maybe he was big, but not that huge, right?
Well, I'm just going to say, why do you think they call it a king size bed? But let's not go there. Anyway.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah. Okay. And the last quote I got from Dr. Reeves is that multiple copies of an Aramaic composition containing stories about the giants were recovered among the Dead Sea Scrolls. Now, why I find this fascinating? Because people who lived in that time, they had hard time piling up, writing down all these, documents, scrolls, making copies. It cost them a lot of money. They had to hide it. They had to hide from the enemies. I mean, this was so precious to them. They wouldn't just hide any garbage. Like they will hide, of course, the word of God, which they consider to be the scripture, but they also would, if they would write something which is part of their Jewish tradition, they would hide something that was precious to them. And then we find this copy of an Aramaic composition which which speaks about giants. So I mean, in your estimation, is this a solid evidence of what we're talking about that was backed by the people in the Second Temple period?
Yeah, it definitely shows that it was really significant material, and particularly in the light of what we know about the Qumran community, it was very important to them that they have some very clear information about what exactly constitutes the righteous as opposed to the sinners or the wicked, because it was a very tight knit community, uh, often referred to as a sect, because they were uh, a little different to the mainstream Jewish community that we're familiar with. Although you can't really call Judaism like a single uh, monolithic religion. I mean, just like you have denominations today in Christian churches, there were Jewish groups all over the place that differed slightly here and there. So it sort of helps us to keep in mind that just like, there's a different church down the road and the other side of town, there's another different church. And, those people see things slightly differently. You have the same in Judaism. But the important thing about the giant traditions is obviously that they share a common source material, which brings us back to Genesis 6. And they're using that material uh, to not only help them explain the biblical uh, data, but that's helping them to shape and define the community and culture and conduct, right? Because when you see what these giants were doing, what they were up to, you've got some pretty powerful reasons presented in those texts to obviously live righteously and to not fall into the temptation to want to follow these traditions, which are um, generally linked to the desire for power in an ungodly way. So yeah, it was really important, and it's nothing short of the providence of God that these things have been preserved for us. We should be so grateful to have access to these texts.
Yeah, amen. I agree. Okay, now we will touch on another person who, as far as I know, is not a scholar, but he's a thorough researcher. His name is Ken Ami, and he, just for those who don't know, he likes researching and writing a lot. He tends to disagree with many scholars, book authors, even some of the Eastern Orthodox priests. And when we talk about this brother, our intention is not to attack him, but just to deal with some of the objections which he writes when it comes to Tim's works. So I just wanted to, analyze few of these for the sake of, just learning from this brother and what he, objects when it comes to your work. So Ken disagrees with Tim. Uh, First, I heard that you guys had a debate or two, and you talked about the top two topics. The first one was Rephaim, Nephilim, and Giborim as giants, and then you guys talked at the post-flood giants. He then disagrees also with Dr. Heiser. He disagrees with Father Stephen DeYoung and all these people. So, in one of these debates and also papers he writes against some of the Tim's conclusions, the first thing is that he says there is no biblical Hebrew word for someone who is taller than average, and note that Hebrew males of biblical times average 5.5 feet or less. I mean, we know this. We, even when we had the previous episode, you and me, Tim, you even said you don't think that in numbers, all those giants mentioned as cedar trees, you don't think that they're literally like 50 feet or something. So we agree. We know this is the work of the history, that Jews of those times, that they were pretty much shorter than contemporary men. So we have no objection when it comes to Ken's assessment, which is true, that people of that time were short. Okay, no problem with that. Then he continues and he says, we have no reliable physical description of Nephilim and they did not make it past the flood, did not survive, did not return, and never will. Is there anything that you would like to say about this?
Yeah, well, it was an interesting time interacting with Ken, an enjoyable debate. I find it interesting we get into these people who disagree on the idea of Nephilim as giants, because you find uh, with people like this, it's very hard to pin them down on exactly what any word actually means. You know, they're quite happy to tell you what it doesn't mean, but trying to get them, you know, to actually come out with this is what it does mean, and getting those claims substantiated, that can be a bit of a challenge. I did have a short debate with Ken, as you mentioned. Unfortunately, the video no longer exists on YouTube because the host took it down. They don't do that particular online radio program anymore, so they deleted the archives. But it didn't take long to get past the semantic game of going around and around in circles trying to say that words don't mean what they mean. Eventually, you have to realize that usage is what determines meaning. So uh, then you have to look at examples of where a term gets used, look at the context. Okay, now we have a definition. You'll find talking with some people, they like to isolate the words from their actual context and disregard the usage that exists in the text because they'd rather take the original Hebrew root and repurpose it. You know, a Hebrew word typically has three, maybe four consonants. There are no vowels in the language, and that root forms the basis of a variety of Hebrew terms. And in the original text, you only had the consonants, so you needed the context around the whole thing to be able to know which uh, possibility actually fit in that context, and that determines how you read it and how you understand it. Um, so you know that's the nature of the written language, and it means that it is open to ambiguity, particularly if you take the word out of its context, because now you have nothing to inform the usage, and you can put anything you want in there, right? So the root can be used to develop a range of different terms. Unfortunately, this means that, yeah, they can just be pulled out, manipulated to say whatever you want. And it's handy to have reliable manuscripts like the Greek Septuagint. Because you get it in a different language, you'll find that the witness of ancient translators who are much closer to the original context than we are, it's going to give us a much better idea of how it would have been read and understood at the time. And it helps us to avoid imposing our own modern scientific worldview on the text. So that's a good place to start if you don't have the word in context, because you can look at translations and see what they're doing with it. Um, but again, there's no substitute for the actual context. As when we look at the root behind Nephilim, we learn that yes, you could read it as meaning to fall or to be fallen. It's the most popular understanding of that term. But what do we have in the context that supports that reading? You know, does anybody fall in Genesis 6? The answer is no. The rebellious sons of God didn't fall anywhere. They didn't fall literally because they were not in heaven, they were on earth. So that's a cosmological argument against the idea of fallen. You have, you know, people who sort of have this hard cosmological model where the sky is a solid dome above, and you know you've got the earth below, and the angels are up there, and if they did something wrong, then they're going to fall down. Um, that actually, you know, like people speak that way, but they don't assume that as a concrete reality, right? Like when I say that God is the man upstairs, I'm not talking like there are stairs and God is up high somewhere. That's a figure of speech, right? And biblical cosmology is the same. Like there are expressions, ways of talking about things. These things have meaning. They're important, but we're not supposed to take them literally. The idea of uh, these sons of God falling uh, doesn't actually mean like they were up high and they plummeted to earth, right? Although it gets talked about that way. So that idea of being fallen uh, doesn't really work. And then you have the fact that it's the Nephilim who are the sons of those rebellious sons of God, not the same people. They were their sons. Um, the other ones called Nephilim, they didn't fall from anywhere, right? So they haven't fallen, um, and they seem to be impugned basically on the basis of their existence. Um, so they haven't necessarily done anything uh, to be called that. That comes right off the bat. They're just described as Nephilim. Um, so yeah, it's a maybe you could talk about a moral sense. The rebellious sons of God were morally bad. Okay, they did the wrong thing. Um, but again, it's the Nephilim, their sons, that are called the fallen ones, not the sons of God. So there's a false association there, trying to take what the fathers did and put it on the sons. Then you have people talking about falling, as in to fall upon others or to cause them to fall, right? So this is sort of uh, perhaps a military understanding, like when there's an ambush, they say, well, we fell upon our enemies and attacked them. Um, so that is a possible interpretation, supported in the text, because you do have all this language of violence and stuff like that in the original source material in Genesis 6. So there's some legitimacy there. The rabbis definitely picked up on that in the medieval period. Talked a lot about this. If you read the Genesis Rabbah, that's full of these kind of discussions, and they basically take that idea of being fallen, and they sort of split that three ways and talk about how all three possible interpretations of being fallen would work. But again, we're in the medieval period reading the rabbis. It's far better to get back to the source material, look at it in context, look at the sources that informed the biblical material, and that's the best place to derive your meaning. Uh, Ultimately, the best way to get a handle on the context is to look at the Mesopotamian background behind the stories illustrated in the primeval history, which is something I tackle a lot in my podcast. But yeah, all we've done so far is examine only one possible variation from the original Hebrew root, right? This idea of being fallen. And just because when we look at the Aramaic use of the same root, we can also find it used the same way, that doesn't invalidate the fact that there are other possibilities within the semantic range of that root in both languages. The fact that we do have in Aramaic a variation on that original root, and it just so happens that appears in the biblical text in Numbers 13, which is the passage about the spies, that's really telling. Okay, they went into Canaan, came back reporting that they had seen the Nephilim. And we get this one occasion where the word is spelt using some of that additional information that's usually missing from a text based on consonants, which informs us as to how it's supposed to be read and interpreted. You don't get it in Genesis 6. Of the two occasions that the term is used in Numbers 13, just one of them has the vowel points, which is amazing, because without that, we really would be scratching our heads and guessing. But it's there. And what it tells us is that the derivation of that word is from Aramaic, not from Hebrew. And I think this was where Ken was having some difficulty, because uh, he is Jewish. He loves his Bible. He's very biblically driven. But I think his assumption coming to the biblical text is that, well, everything here is Hebrew. And so when you come across a word that doesn't have a Hebrew background, he's not familiar with it. So to then see that we can read this as Nephil, meaning giant, which is preserved today actually in the zodiac. There's a constellation called Nephila, the giant. That constellation is Orion, the hunter, right? Nimrod, the same one, the same name, right? Nephila, the giant. And that is the term, or derived from that, Nephilim, it's plural, that we find in Numbers 13. So that's why that passage is important, because it gives us that direct connection because we actually have vowel points preserved there in that one instance. So, you'd have to ask them, well, why? Why put an Aramaic word in a Hebrew text? And again, this is where Ken was right because the Hebrew language doesn't have a word for giants. Okay, so that's fine. What do you do when you don't have a word? You import one, right? And I mean, we do this all the time in English when we're talking, right? I mean, you're cooking something in the kitchen, you bring it out and you say, voila, suddenly we're French. We just pop these words in from other languages to give it a certain je ne sais quoi, right? We do that. And everyone knows what we mean when we do it. Like, no one's going to come along years from now and listen to me having just said that and go, oh, this is clearly wrong because he said something that wasn't English. Like this is just how people speak and how people use language. So it's quite normal. It's quite natural. And there's nothing wrong with it. So, I just want to challenge people who might be sort of thinking, well, it's the Hebrew Bible, everything should be Hebrew, to consider that sometimes the best word for the job isn't going to be from the native language of the scribe. And, that's not a problem if you're aware of the Mesopotamian context of the primeval history, because, like, everyone speaks Aramaic in Babylon. Okay. But for most people who assume that every word of the Torah was personally authored by Moses, yeah, that can be a problem. Having said that, Moses was educated by the finest minds in Egypt. Like, even if you want to say that this was all Moses and he wrote every word, he's still going to know stuff that doesn't derive from Hebrew. So there's something to think about. So yeah, I think that was a bit of an issue for Ken when we had that discussion. Although we didn't actually get to talk about it in any great detail, we ran out of time, unfortunately. And I mean, that's another example. I talked about the fact that Joshua and Caleb were the only two people among the spies who were not Israelites, ethnically speaking. Like, their parents came from other nations, and that seemed to throw a few people off. And I don't think Ken was prepared for that. And a few people who responded afterward to that chat, just thought this was ridiculous. Oh, how could you say that? Joshua's dad has an Egyptian name, right? Remember the mixed multitude that came out of Egypt at the Exodus? There were Egyptians in that group, right? Joshua wasn't even his original name. And Caleb was another guy whose dad came from a different ethnic group. Again, this is all stuff that you get from just reading the Bible. You've got to be prepared to take it in context, and that's where a lot of these critical interpreters fall down. But here's Numbers 13, verse 16. These are the names of the men Moses sent to explore the land. Moses gave Hoshea, son of Nun, the name Joshua. Right, so there it is in the text. This guy whose dad has an Egyptian name has his name changed by Moses. Then we have Numbers 32, verse 12. Not one except Caleb, son of Jephunneh the Kenizzite. What's that? He's not Israelite. And Joshua, son of Nun, for they followed the Lord wholeheartedly. So, yeah, these two guys, it's interesting that they're the only ones who are faithful enough to say, yeah, we can take the promised land, and they were not Jewish. Now, I mentioned the Greek text earlier, that word gigantes, which occurs in the Septuagint. I note that Ken makes a big deal about associating that with the meaning earthborn rather than giant. That's actually incorrect, because that's a definition associated with a slightly different word, which is gigenes. That's the word that, according to Greek usage, actually means earthborn, literally generated from the earth. By the way, earthborn means specifically of the union of heaven and earth, which is allegorically the union between the sons of God and the daughters of men anyway. So even if you want to argue that it's a different word there and it means a different thing, you can't get around it. Gigantes is a different term, not to be confused with it, and we do have evidence from ancient Greek sources that it is supposed to be understood in many contexts as referring to people of great size and strength. As I mentioned last time, that doesn't mean we're supposed to be thinking in fairy tale terms like Jack and the Beanstalk scale. However, it was a tradition among the Greeks that these individuals could be anywhere up to 15 feet tall. One of these in particular was named Anax. And you might think, I've heard that before. Is that something to do with the Anakim? Anakim does not mean long-necked. A lot of people are going to say that, right? Because what they're doing is they're picking up on the Jewish use of the term, right? I mean, the Hebrew scribes, they love to make fun of their enemies, and they will just twist the name a little bit and make them sound stupid, right? They do this with Nimrod, right? His name was Enmerkar. You take those consonants, you have this N, M, R. They put a D on the end, make it Nimrod, by which they mean the rebel. Okay, so they take someone who's supposedly respected and feared and some great guy, and then they just make fun of him. And they do the same thing with the Anakim. So uh, they sort of tweak the name a bit so that in Hebrew it means long necked, but that's not where it comes from, right? But again, if you can't look past the idea that the Hebrews actually did borrow words from other languages here and there, you're going to miss it. In fact, it has early Egyptian and later Greek derivation, hence the connections with Proto-Greek cultures like the Hittites and Hurrians, and later Phoenicians, from which we get Perizzites, Philistines, etc. The royalty connection is exemplified in the Anakim. The biblical account tells us that some of the kings among the Anakim, the sons of Anak. Anak is not just a name, but also a title from the Greek anax, meaning king, right? So there it is. Now, it's one of the many titles of Apollo, who had a temple in Athens dedicated to the worship of the Anakis, protector gods, similar to the Mesopotamian Apkalus. Right. So if you're familiar with all that stuff, anyone who's a fan of Dr. Heiser will have spent some time learning about the Apkallu. So we're in the same ballpark here. We're just coming at it from different cultural angles. Right. The Bible tells us that the Anakim, or more accurately, Ben Anak, sons of Anak, were descended from a man named Abba, father of Anak, after whom was named Kiryat Arba, the city of the tree, later known as Hebron. A lot of people have said, oh, it's the city of the four, right? Arba is close to the Hebrew four. Again, the assumption that it's a Hebrew word in the text, but we actually have in the Greek Arbios. Okay, so the name Arba comes from Arbion, a verdant mountain, nice lush green mountain on the island of Crete, which features a prominent temple to Zeus, Arbios, the god of the tree. According to the ancient Greek author Pausanias, in his work, The Description of Greece, the father of Anax, named Asterius, was said to be at least 10 cubits in height. Now, you might think there's some confusion there because the Bible says that Arba was the father of Anak, and this historiographer is telling us that it was Asterius. The fact that we have a situation here where all these names are actually titles rather than personal names. It's the same with Og of Bashan. That's a title, it's not a name. According to Homer, Anax was an archaic title most suited to legendary heroes and gods rather than contemporary kings. Taking it back further, the Egyptian derivation of Anak can be traced back to the earliest hieroglyphs. If you've seen the Ankh before, is that symbol that looks like a Christian cross, but it's got a little loop on the top. In its earliest use, that was intended to describe a spirit within a person, not just their physical organic life or the quality of being alive, but a spirit within the person. This was originally not for the common man; it was for the divinized rulers. Okay, so if you were a king empowered by an ancient spirit or a divine being of some kind, that's how that was used. That's what it meant. Later, that meaning changes over time, but in its earlier stages, that's where it comes from, and you can actually trace that back to Mesopotamia as well with the Anzu. This idea of the ascent into the divine realm to get access to the primeval knowledge, the secrets of civilization, and everything that made civilization so great. So the hieroglyph of the Ankh shows a tree reaching up to touch the sun. Right, so the little loop on the top, that's the sun, and then you have the tree underneath reaching up to touch it. And the idea of deification, glorification is all sort of tied into this, right? So reaching up to glory. We see how it is that the author of Numbers 13:33 was able to say that the Anakim come of the Nephilim, right? Because we have that thematic connection. We had these people before and after the flood trying to find some way to access divine power and to get some great strength and power over others by means of intermingling with the divine somehow. Now, early in the piece, you had that direct uh, physical sexual contact between the sons of God and the daughters of men, which I talked about before. Um, the next time around, things are different. After the flood, God changes something, and you just don't have the interaction happening in the same way. So now it's done through these ritual processes, and you've got to have these temples. You've got to go through certain rituals. You've got to perform invocations. The idea is to sort of channel the spirits of the Nephilim from before, right? Who still exist, and they're roaming around in this shadowy, disembodied existence. Try and channel them into the body of the king, and this is how the Rephaim come about, right? So this is what we see when we look at the Greek use of anax, and we have the Zeus Arbios, the idea of the deified ruler represented by a tree on a mountain that reaches to heaven. In the Bible, we get this imagery, Ezekiel 31, a passage that connects us back to that enigmatic character known as the Assyrian or Nimrod I mentioned just earlier. He's the guy responsible for a man-made mountain that was built to reach heaven, right? Remember the Tower of Babel? And the name Asterius actually means star, which, in ancient culture is associated with divine beings, right? So this idea of, again, reaching to the heavens to take divine power. Both Asterius and Arbios were titles ascribed to Zeus. Interestingly, in the Bible, of course, John connects Zeus with Satan. Now, seeing Babel as the origin of royal human deification makes sense of all these ethnic variations of the concept, including the Greek mythology. It ties in with the worldview that Scripture presents, showing that the nations were subjected to the rule of lesser gods following the rebellion at Babel. And those who participated at Babel became the divinized rulers of the nations, imbued with the spirits of the Nephilim, and recognized as such by their tall stature. They were known by many tribal names, but collectively they were called Anakim, the ascended masters.
I'm jealous how much you can talk without notes, giving all this information, throwing sources, scholars, all these words in Aramaic or Hebrew, Bible verses. I'm amazed. So because you mentioned so many things that Ken wrote in his paper, or when he disagreed with you, but also which he mentioned when he was debating you, I just want to mention them for the sake of audience hearing again. So Ken said that the problem is that rendering both words Nephilim and Rephaim as giants only causes confusion. Then he mentions that the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Old Testament, rendering Nephilim as gigantes, which literally means earthborn and implies nothing about height. You mentioned this as well. Then he quotes J. Edward Wright, PhD, who is the director of the Arizona Center for Judaic Studies of the University of Arizona, who says that the term traditionally translated as giants in both the Greek Septuagint and now in English is Nephilim, a term based on the root NPL, which means fall, which you talked about just recently. It has nothing to do with size, and specifies that this goes for both Hebrew and Aramaic, that the root NPL in Aramaic also means fall and not giants. You also address this. Now I have question for the last quote that I have from Ken. He says, as per the original, traditional, and majority view among the earliest Jews and Christians alike for centuries, Nephilim were strictly pre-flood hybrids, and Rephaim were strictly post-flood humans, and there is no relation between them whatsoever. I have to be honest, when I read this last night, it made me think so hard. I was like, okay, let me ask Tim the expert. So, would you agree or disagree? And can you please say why would you agree or disagree when he says that there is no connection between Nephilim and Rephaim? Because for him, the first were just pre flood hybrids, and Rephaim were just post flood humans.
Yeah. Okay. So there's a whole bunch of things that contribute to that distinction from that perspective. Firstly, uh, you need to view the flood as universal, comprehensive, like the entire world, the globe that we know was completely inundated with water, and only those on board the ark survived, none of which had anything to do with the Nephilim. If that's your understanding, then you have to say, okay, so there's no continuity between the Nephilim back then and these Rephaim that come after, at least in a physical sense, right? Because all these other living things, everything dies. Now, even if you take that, you still have the fact that these divine beings who are immortal cohabited with humans and created offspring. When their bodies die, the spirits are still around. And this was well known to the Jewish audience and widely commented on and believed um, throughout Judaism and, in particular, early Christianity before it became, um, before it fell out of favor, I suppose. So the only thing you've got to establish is the connection between those spirits and the people who come after. Um, Now, I've already mentioned the cultic rituals that were used by the Amorites, later picked up by the Babylonians and uh, scattered throughout the Promised Land and the outskirts of Israel proper as well, um, which were responsible for the proliferation of these giant clans after the flood. They've found some means of connecting themselves with the spirits of these giants, uh, with the effect that through, I believe, necromantic ritual. I mean, we don't have anything super solid on this, but they're doing something that affects some change in themselves, right? And I do get some pushback from people who say, "Oh, so you're saying it's magic?" And I'm like, "Well, magic actually is a real thing, whether we want to believe it today or not, right?" And I mean, it existed back then, and we have records of it in the Bible. You've got the Pharaoh's magicians doing things and all the rest. There are powers at work that we don't understand, and this is a very mysterious topic. I believe that the Bible is intentionally very quiet about these things because it would be bad for us to have this knowledge. Um, but nevertheless, you've got something going on where you have these people described as being tall. I mean, again, you don't have real descriptive language. Ken was right in saying that you don't have a lot of um, particular language around the size of these individuals. But when you read through Deuteronomy and you have, oh, these people were as tall as the Anakim, like they're not saying that because they were short. They're saying because they were bigger than normal, right? That's the whole purpose of communication. That's how language works. And when you talk to people and you say, "Oh, this guy was as tall as such and such," you mean that they were bigger, not smaller, right? That's just how language works. So all we're informed about is that they were big, and the linguistic connections in the names and identities of these different tribes and everything give us some picture of how they were associated with the um, Amorite cult, where the dead were venerated, possibly even worshipped, and definitely were called upon for empowering the living supernaturally. And we have evidence of that from Ugarit. There are some tablets known as the Rephaim texts, which describe an incantation where the dead Rephaim are summoned to empower the living king. Right. So we got evidence that the stuff goes on. We don't really know how it works, um, but it's there. Okay. So we do have a connection between the Nephilim and the Rephaim, but it's not a biological one. And I think that's where a lot of people fall down, because if that's your only frame of reference, if that's the only way that you can understand how this works, then it's not going to make any sense.
Wow, thank you for that. I have to admit I didn't think it with so many layers as you just explained, especially the last part about not just comparing purely or merely through biological lenses. So yeah, thank you for that. The last person I wanted to to mention before we continue with the rest of the outline for tonight is Brian R. I don't know if it's Doak or Doak. I apologize for butchering his last name. He's a professor of biblical studies, and I have a bunch of quotation which I think when he writes it, he would tend to agree much more with you, Tim, um, than with Ken. So let's start from the beginning. He says that if anything is secondary, Genesis 6:4, it is the and also afterward clause, which could have been easily added to make sense of the fact that these Nephilim, understood superordinately as giants, on parallel with Rephaim in Deuteronomy 2:11, clearly appear later in the storyline, not only in Numbers 13:33, but also in the figure of Og of Bashan and others in the conquest, not to mention Goliath. And we already talked about this, so he agrees with you. Good. Then he says the prominence of Og, king of the land of the Rephaim, as an adversary in the memory of the wilderness, wandering, and conquest led biblical authors to gesture toward both a gigantic stature for this king as well as his semi divine identity. A fragmentary and debated Ugaritic reference KTU 108 and then 1-3 suggests that the territory the Bible ascribes to Og and the Rephaim was viewed by at least the 14th or 13th century BCE. So this is going way before, as the habitation of a certain Rapiu, which was a patron deity of the Rapiuma in Ugaritic myth. I think this is important. So before I go with the next quotation, maybe you want to just jump in and explain or add some background commentary to our viewers how Brian makes connection between the Bible and the Ugaritic scriptures.
Yeah, sure. Okay, so Rapiu is kind of like this underworld deity who sort of functions in that context as like the Lord of the Dead. Okay, so other groups are going to say, Baal or Zeus or whoever you fill in the blank. It depends on the culture and the language group and that sort of thing as to what the names are. But in this context, the Rapiu is like the top dog, and then you have the Rapiuma, who are sort of his underlings, and this is where we have these deceased rulers and that sort of thing. The heroes of the past are associated with the biblical Rephaim, again connected back to the pre-flood Nephilim on a spiritual level. Okay, so we're all sort of in that same group. Again, it's a different tradition, but in this you have Og of Bashan. You note in the Bible it says Og, king of Bashan, right? But he's not just called the king of Bashan. And I mentioned this a moment ago. Og is actually a title, and it's something like a kind of priestly function. okay, where he has some connection uh, spiritually to these underworld gods, and he functions as the king and the sort of the connection to the power of these underworld deities and their minions. All right, so interestingly enough, in some manuscripts of the Septuagint, you have Og used interchangeably with the word Gog. So if you've read Ezekiel, you know about Gog and Magog and all this, which comes up again in Revelation 12. We're talking about the same guy. And a lot of people don't realize that, but yeah, there's a lot of tradition underlying all that too, which is particularly picked up in Greek traditions from these early periods, where you have Og referred to as, I think, Ogyges or Ogygius, depending on which translations you're looking at, um, and the land of Boeotia, which is, I think, a transliteration from Bashan. So again, we're in that same area. So the Greek mythology sort of overlaps into this, and you have this idea that you've got this guy who functions as the connection between the underworld and the land of the living. Yeah, so some interesting stuff there. That's why he's so prominent in the Bible. Also connected to this is Agag, king of the Amalekites. Again, we have the same thing. So Og, Agag, Gog. These are all um, linguistic variations on the same concept. You've got this guy who's in charge of the people, but he's getting his power from the realm of the dead.
Yeah, thanks for that. Um, I just want to read quickly a few points which you already analyzed in advance and which Brian mentions. So I think it's important for us to read from, um, I don't know if he's a scholar, but as a professor of biblical studies, I would say that he has a lot of credibility in what he writes. So I just want to read this to help us understand what you just said. So he says that in Deuteronomy 1:4 and Joshua 12:4, Og is described as reigning or enthroned in the same location as Rapiu, which we just mentioned, that was patron deity in Ugaritic myth, um, using the same language, further suggesting reliance on earlier tradition in the Bible's memory of Og as a shadowy, fearsome leader with connections to the divine realm. As such, and as one of the aboriginal inhabitants of the Levant or Levant, I'm not sure, Og would also then be a giant, as would his people, the Rephaim. And then it says, check Deuteronomy 2 11, 20, and 3:11. Then he says that scholars have approached this odd dichotomy between the living and dead Rephaim in various ways, usually assuming some transfer of meaning from one realm to the other. For example, Rephaim originally referred to the dead, but was transferred to the Rephaim of the conquest, or it originally referred to living warriors in the conquest who were demoted to impotent shades of the dead in later tradition. And one more quick thing. A more productive and holistic approach to the question, however, would be to see the Rephaim as semi-divine heroic figures along the lines of archaic and classical Greek hero concepts, as well as at late Bronze Age Ugarit, where great warriors of the ancient times not only claimed divine parentage but also continued to function through the hero cult as a force of fertility, protection, and for contemporary devotees. Um, this is a lot of information to unpack. We don't have maybe that much time, but I just love how what you just said in advance, Brian already has in his articles, which are, by the way, all available for free on Academia EDU. All of these people I'm quoting, their work is available for free. So what can we say about him giving this context when it comes to Rephaim being semi-divine, including King Og. Like you said, this is more than just a name. This was a title, right?
Yeah, that's right. I think he's absolutely correct in this. It makes far more sense to view this semi-divine interpretation rather than um, you know retrospectively saying, "Oh, well, they're called Rephaim because they all got killed," right? I mean, which really just strips all the culture and all the mythology and everything built up around these people in everything that they did and everything that they wrote. Just disregards all of it in order to sort of do away with a supernatural interpretation. Um, so yeah, I think he's right. You have to look at this as incorporating the earthly and the divine elements because that's what all the source material is pointing toward. That's the evidence that we get archaeologically. We see the veneration of these entities in the everyday life and practice of Canaanites and those further north. The Hittites and Hurrians and the rest of it as well. They lived and breathed this stuff, and I think we do them a great disservice to strip those elements out of their culture and reduce it to physicality and mistaken understandings about the way the world really works.
Yeah. So Brian, I'm almost done with him. He says that in summary of this strand of biblical giant thinking, giants are not simply abnormally big humans, but rather they function as anti-gods who transgress boundaries human and divine mis,
Miscegenation, that's a tough word.
yes, that's a complicated word. Thank you for helping me. In Genesis 6:1-4, or guard geographical boundaries with cosmic significance. Then he mentions Og and the Rephaim in Transjordan, blocking God's people, the Israelites. Then he also says that one may compare Israel's imagination of the passing of the age of giants in the conquest, notwithstanding David's later encounter with Goliath and David's mighty man in conflict with other giants, with the archaic Greek rumination on the end of the heroic age insofar as both literatures imagined the collapse of the great late Bronze civilization as a climatic battle. And then he finally finishes by saying that the Enochic insistence of the shade-like existence of the giants had indeed already found expression in Ezekiel 32, where the fallen Giborim of the ancient world reside in Sheol, defeated and powerless, just like the Egyptian pharaoh, whom Ezekiel says will join their ranks. Very interesting, I think. Thus, the spirit giants of Enoch stand in continuity with Ezekiel's presentation centuries earlier. I'm thankful for the work of Brian because even though his chapter in this book, which is again available on Academia Edu, is not that long, is packed with so much wealth of information, and he quotes a lot of other scholars. So what can we say when he mentions Ezekiel 32, fallen Gibberim being in Sheol, the Egyptian pharaoh who will join them? How is this helping our case of in the case you're making in your book?
Yeah, well, it's definitely backing it up, and it assumes that the audience are familiar with these ideas, that that's how they understand it too, and that for them this is a coherent worldview that just everything falls into place. Nobody was shocked and surprised to read this in Ezekiel 32 and say, "Wow, I never realized that these dead people, still existed in the underworld and had some limited influence and agency through people who were channeling their spirits." Like that stuff was well known, well documented, and just assumed rather than questioned. That's the ancient worldview. And as far as our understanding of it, are we supposed to think that they were primitive and foolish and, that wasn't really true? I don't think so. I think we're supposed to take those things seriously.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. I think we're done with this section where we were analyzing all these different people. Um, and again, even if we disagree with them, we can still learn from them. And I would like to touch on the Book of Giants, which is as some of people know, the Old Testament Apocrypha, which matches in its writing some of the stuff from Genesis or even the Book of Enoch. And I'm not sure 100%. You would know better than me. I don't think we have the Book of Giants in its totality. We don't have whole, but we have some of the fragments or majority of the fragments. So I just wanted to you to just say something about this book when it comes to its summary, significance, how well was it accepted, how it helps us to see the giants, Genesis 6, First Enoch, what is the challenge of this book, anything that can help us better understand this very interesting topic of the Nephilim.
Yeah. Okay. So yeah, the Book of Giants is interesting. You've got a lot of people using it as primary source material, which is problematic because it's clearly derivative of First Enoch and other material that betrays Israel's post-exilic Mesopotamian influences. Something I'll be talking about in when season 6 of the Answers to Giant Questions podcast launches in a couple of weeks is the direct influence of classic Mesopotamian literature on the authors of the primeval history. And that influence carries on in the Enochic tradition, which forms the basis of the Book of Giants. We didn't really know a lot about that until relatively recently. For a long time, it was believed that ancient Persians, the Manichaeans, had originally composed the Book of Giants independently of Semitic sources. But the discoveries at Qumran changed that and brought the earliest date for the core material back about 300 years. Nowadays, it's commonly accepted that the Manichaean tradition was late and derived from a Hebrew original in the Enochic tradition. In any case, what we see in the Book of Giants is basically a midrash on a midrash. So the biblical story of Genesis 6 gets expanded and elaborated on by the Enochic scribes who reinterpret it by reading it in light of Torah. And then the Enochic story of Genesis 6 gets expanded and elaborated on by the Book of Giants scribes who reinterpret it by reading it and in light of Torah. And then they chuck in Gilgamesh and his friends to add some Mesopotamian credibility. What that does for us is tell us a little bit about the authority afforded to the Babylonian material, which is naturally overshadowed by the Torah as the superior text. But it's clear that the Book of Giants is so derivative it can't be taken seriously as a primary source. So yeah, it's interesting there when you get into looking at the giants, and most people's first stop for information on the giants is start hunting down popular researchers, usually um, YouTube videos and popular books and whatnot that will make a lot of noise about the Book of Giants because they're deriving a lot of information from there, um, without necessarily realizing that the Book of Giants is itself drawing from a lot of other earlier sources, which are probably a bit more credible. So I would suggest that while it's interesting to read the Book of Giants and to see how people were thinking about these things, it's also worthwhile keeping in mind that the Book of Giants didn't have widespread acceptance in the Jewish or Christian communities by any stretch. You just find it in little sectarian groups here and there. I mean, the Manichaeans were uh, way off in their view of the Bible and understanding of uh, the truth as we know it. Um, but it's interesting. You can just get some of those insights as to how people thought about these things, what they were doing with uh, the biblical text, what they were doing with the Enochic traditions in light of the biblical text. So kind of reading it backwards 2 steps. But yeah, there's some interesting stuff comes out of it.
Yeah, before I ask you the last question on giants, and then we'll have a couple more subsections. I forgot to say when we were talking about people who disagree with you. Recently, I was just browsing Facebook and I saw a post from a friend whom you may know. I'm not going to mention his name, and who recommended your book on his Facebook page. And some man, a man of faith, came and he objected, and his objection was to this guy, and his recommendation of your book was, how can someone write 400 pages on based on word Nephilim, which is mentioned 2 times in the Bible? What is there to talk about? And even though it's not my book, I was provoked as it was almost my book. So I was like, well, let me tell you the book of contents. Let me just tell you what there is to talk about. I don't think he ever responded, but it just says how some people can have well meaningful and good arguments. They know how to find good sources. They know how to outline them. They know how to think logically, and then you have something like this. I didn't want to tell you before we met, before we went live, so that when we came to the section of Ken and him disagreeing with you, I just wanted to mention this, but then I forgot, just for like, you know, just for one subsection ago. I just want to say how, this reminds me of the, just one example, when people say, oh yeah, Trinity, well, that word doesn't exist in the Bible, like it's false. So it's not the perfect example, but it just reminds me of like, oh, this concept is that this word doesn't exist, or it's not taught, therefore it's false. So forget about everything, like you were mentioning earlier. Forget about everything that the context is teaching. Forget about the culture, the history. Forget about anything that is associated with a certain term and terminology. If we just seek for one word or for one specific term, and we don't find many examples in the Bible, or maybe one or two, we can easily discard an essential topic that can lead us to essential doctrine like the Trinity, and discard it. So in the same fashion, this guy was about to discard your whole book, and he never bought your book. He never read your book. He was like, what is there to talk about the Nephilim? Like, it's barely even mentioned in the Bible. So I thought that was silly. It's just, which I didn't think it was personally against you, because the guy doesn't know you. You just thought like, well, it's almost like, it almost looked like you wanted to write a book because it bring sensationalism. It's like so cool and interesting, maybe even let's make money of it. But it's not. You spend a decade researching this topic, and you put so much more information. I even think that if you want to, you can in the future write an expanded version of this book with the more information that you'll find eventually. So I wanted to thank you for all the hard work you have put in your book. So the last question when it comes to this topic: are there any archaeological data for giant skeletons? So I asked the same question when I had Becca several weeks ago, who has masters in biblical archaeology, and I was like, please, Becca, tell me that we have some data. Tell me that all those Photoshop photos from the internet. Tell me that, please, one is true. When you see archaeologists, and then their whole body is big, like a skull of all those giants. Like, please tell me. And I have some books from L.A. Marzulli. I'm like, please tell me something is true. She was like, no, I'm sorry, none of that is true. I'm like, come on, like, you're just ruining my mood. I want it to be true. I seriously want it to be true. And I was like, what about all those conspiracy theories that Smithsonian has tons of all these giant bones and skeletons? She said, nope, none of that is true. So I just wanted to ask you, as another person, maybe there is 1% hope, so you can tell me that you found some data of giant bones or skeletons. Please tell me.
Well, firstly, I'm going to say, um, well, getting back to what you said earlier, thank you for your kind words about my work, and yeah, it's great to have people prepared to make a little effort and put in some thought and consideration about these topics, because yeah, they're not in the Bible for no reason. But yeah, getting back to archaeology, I was watching that episode with Becca. I thought it was great, and I'm going to agree with her. But I also have some other things to say about that. Archaeology is interesting because it forces us to go beyond simply textual witnesses, right? When you read ancient literature, a lot of it is storytelling. So there's a temptation to say, well, they're telling a story, they're free to exaggerate, they're free to use a bit of poetic license. They're going to say things like, we were like grasshoppers in their sight, as we see in Numbers 13, or, in Amos chapter 2, they're as tall as the cedar trees. We read that and we think, right, well, if archaeology is going to help us here, then we need to see giant bones, right? That's what we need to see. We want to see, a human femur bone that's, 7 feet tall. And if we don't find that, then we haven't found the biblical giants, right? That's what we're all looking for. The reality is a little different. And, we've talked about the realistic size of the giants already. So, what are we expecting to find? Now, the execration texts from Egypt were interesting because they brought to light the fact that the Egyptians were terrified of these people that they called the Shazu, who were described in other Egyptian sources as being of some considerable height. I think somewhere around 8 feet 6 inches. I think was the conversion, right? So again, that's literary, but I mean we find these these pieces of pottery, right? Because the execration text was basically like a bowl. You would write things on the bowl, like a curse or something against these people that you didn't like, and then you smash it, right? And because you've broken the thing, the words can't be taken back, right? So it's a curse with a permanent effect. That's the idea, right? So even the Egyptians were terrified of these people. But there's heaps more. A few years ago, there was a paper released by the archaeological team excavating the site of the biblical city of Gath, which, of course, we know as the birthplace of Goliath, the giant. Okay, so they're exploring the 11th to 10th century BC layers, so corresponding to the time of David and Goliath, and they discovered some interesting stuff. The thickness of the city walls happens to exactly match in the number of cubits employed with the height of the giant Philistine as recorded in the earliest manuscript traditions of the Hebrew Bible, excluding the Masoretic text. The discovery has led to talk of Goliath himself as perhaps not really a giant, but rather a literary representation of the city of Gath, a way of embodying the strength of the city by personifying it as a giant soldier. But this interpretation is not without its flaws. So there's a number of reasons why it's incoherent to arrive at the conclusion that Goliath may not have been a giant on the basis of this discovery. The biblical text explicitly refers to Goliath's height in 1 Samuel 17:4, and there came out from the camp of the Philistines a champion named Goliath of Gath, whose height was 6 cubits and a span, 4 cubits and a span if you're reading the original or the earliest manuscripts. Height, of course, is not the same as thickness, right? I mean, even pre-scientific people are well aware of that. The words are not easily confused either. You've got gobar, which is the word for height, against rochab, which is thickness. You can find biblical examples of this usage, right? They're not easily confused. Okay, so height and thickness aren't the same. If a comparison or some kind of simile was intended, it would have made more sense to use consistent dimensions. So, Goliath's height versus wall height, or Goliath's thickness, maybe a measurement of his chest or something, versus the wall thickness, right? If that's the comparison you're trying to make, then, some consistent measurements would probably be employed. Drawing a comparison between different dimensions, height versus thickness, is problematic and not really an effective illustration. Especially as a literary device. I mean, the words are there on the text, and they're very different. Now they have a different cubit um, seen at the site of Tel Es Safi. It's 54 centimeters or 21 and a quarter inches for those who use freedom units, as opposed to the common cubit of 18 inches, which was the standard in the region at the time. So that would actually make Goliath taller. Okay, so if we want to say that these units of measurement corresponded to Goliath's height, then suddenly we've turned him from 6 feet 9 to 7 foot 11. That's not an argument for taking away from his height. Biblical authors generally make less of Israel's enemies rather than glorifying them. So making Goliath any bigger actually works counter to the narrative. There's also nothing else in the description of Goliath that's been shown to correlate with any other aspect of the city of Gath, save for the fact that he came from there. So, I mean, this makes the single coincidental statistic seem a bit out of place. Like, maybe it's a bit of a stretch to apply those things. And adding to the cognitive dissonance of this suggested correlation is the fact that the battle in which Goliath is defeated doesn't take place at Gath, nor does that city fall in the aftermath of said battle. It would have been presumptuous to compare Goliath's death with the anticipated fall of a city that was clearly still standing at the time. So the story doesn't even work. The repeated title Goliath of Gath serves not to equate Goliath with Gath, but to associate him with the Anakim, who were said to be of great stature, as per Numbers 13, which we've talked about, and known to have fled there at the conquest of Canaan under Joshua, which we've seen in Joshua 11, verse 22. The association reminds us that he comes from a land of giants, thus reinforcing the understanding that he really was an enormous warrior. Right? So there's a handful of good reasons why we should understand that the traditional understanding of Goliath as a giant warrior isn't challenged by this coincidental statistic discovered at Tel Es Safi. But the key takeaway is that city was actually really huge. We're talking monumental stone blocks. We're talking large scale construction, right? This is no small city. And that was the whole excitement of sort of digging to this level and making these discoveries, was finding that the place had these huge fortifications, that everything was on this grand scale. And again, we're not talking, 30 foot, 60 foot, giant warriors. We're talking about big people. Okay. If we take the earliest sources seriously, Goliath 6 feet 9. So, he's the size of an average NBA center, right? So that's still a big deal in a time where people average, and I mean, even Ken, I mean, he was right to say these guys are less than, 5.5 feet tall anyway, 5'3" on average. So yeah, that's still a big deal. And we can still call them giants in light of the cultural norms of the day. And we also have the discovery of a stone tablet from the summit of Mount Hermon. Now, this one's interesting. Doug Hamp writes about this in his book, Corrupting the Image, Volume 2. You've got an inscription there in very early Greek language, which he translates as follows. According to the command of the great bull god Batios, those swearing an oath in this place go forth. Okay, so that's the inscription on a stone tablet which was found at the summit of Mount Hermon. Now, anyone who knows the story of First Enoch, of course, familiar with this place, familiar with the story. You can see the correlations between what happened in the story and what's inscribed on this ancient tablet. So that's familiar ground there. So we've got some hard evidence that even if that inscription wasn't actually connected to the real event, you've got people recording it, right? People know the story from way, way back. I mean, we're talking 6th, 7th century BC. Okay, that inscription is up there before the Israelites go into exile in Babylon, before they get direct first-hand exposure to Mesopotamian texts that talk about the Apkallu and the flood stories and all the rest of it, the Epic of Gilgamesh, all these other things that they're exposed to in Babylon, that's up there earlier than that. Okay, and that comes from the earliest Greeks, okay, who trace their lineage back through the Hittites, the Hurrians, and back into Mesopotamia that way. Okay, so those stories came around sort of circuitously to the north of Babylon and then around to the west. Um, and sort of integrated in back into Amorite culture, which had originally entered uh, Mesopotamia from the south. So all this stuff kind of circled around the Israelites, who were probably among the last to actually um, canonize this kind of material in their own writings. So that's really interesting. Yeah, so one of the things I get all the time is, why don't we see credible reports of ancient bones and that sort of thing, right? I mean, just talked about this, giant bones. Why aren't we finding them? How come there are so many frauds and fakes and photoshops and all the rest doing the rounds? I mean, if the giants really existed, then where are they? Show me the money, right? We want to see the bones. There are a couple of ways to approach that. First, we need to get an idea of the scale of this issue. Like, what kind of population should we reasonably expect to have found in the region described in the biblical text? I'd suggest that the ancient Near East in the antediluvian period probably supported many hundreds of thousands of individuals until the population began to deplete resources and turn in on itself, which is what the biblical text describes. But what things can happen to remains that would deplete the amount discoverable in the modern age? Firstly, we can think of catastrophe, so warfare, flood. Okay, I mean, what's going on in Genesis 6 to 8, right? Then we have culture, so people will migrate with the bones of their ancestors. Okay, we saw that with Joseph, right? And in the Amorites, you have the Kispum rituals, which was the veneration of the dead. So they buried the dead ancestors basically under the dirt floor of the house. Okay, so the house was built on top of the gravesite of the ancestors, and they had a little tube which kind of plumbed down into the grave itself, where they would pour drink offerings and stuff like that, because the idea was you fed your ancestors regularly, and they had a monthly ritual for this.
Sorry to
Or in the case
interrupt.
of,
My people do the same when someone dies. They still do it nowadays.
oh yeah,
Well, not
oh
just
yeah,
my people. I think many nations and cultures still do it nowadays.
yeah. No, you're right, and it still happens here too. Uh, Here in Australia, particularly, I think of Anzac Day. So that's when we commemorate fallen soldiers. All right, and you will see people that will have a flask of usually it's rum that they're drinking, and they'll tip some out on the ground for fallen soldiers, to pay respect. Okay, so that's the kind of stuff that goes right back to that. Right now, I'm not saying that when you tip out a bit of rum on the ground or however you do it, that you are, participating in satanic rituals, but that's where those ideas come from. Okay, so yeah, when you start tipping fluids down into a grave site, it's not going to take long for whatever's down there to decompose, right? Um, so those things have an effect on human remains that would be detrimental. The other thing that can happen is cannibalism. Okay, so First Enoch says that they were eating each other. All right, and you've got some allusions to that possibly in the biblical text. It doesn't come straight out and say it, but I think you could make a case for it. So again, this is another reason for giant remains to be depleted, and it's not just other people or giants eating the remains. You also have animals, of course, and certain animals can eat entire carcasses, including the bones. Okay, so you got vultures, hyenas, that sort of thing, right? They will leave nothing behind. So after a battle in particular, you see all that imagery in the biblical text. They always say things like, "Oh, I'm gonna feed your flesh to the birds of the air and the beasts of the field." They say these things in battle, to threaten them, like you're going to die, and then the birds are going to come and consume what's left. There'll be nothing left of you. And the big threat behind that statement was not, "Oh no, my body's going to be dead, and that's the end of existence." It was more a case of there will be nothing for your ancestors to venerate. They will not preserve your remains and keep you alive in the afterlife by feeding you ritually. You're going to be gone, and you will not be remembered, and you will not be honored in the afterlife. You will not be sustained in the afterlife. You have no chance of resurrection, right? So this is a big deal. Um, so yeah, it was commonly known that the birds of the air and the beasts of the field could completely remove a person from living memory, and that was the big statement being made there. And the other thing is construction. The process of civilization, just over and over and over, just building on top of things, building on top of buildings, and things constantly being dug up and demolished and whatever. I mean, that's going to take a toll um, anywhere. A lot of the reason that we haven't been able to excavate significant sites is because people live on top of it, right? You've just got layer upon layer upon layer, and there are people living on the top. Now, you don't get to say to them, "Hey, can you just like pick up your whole family and everything you do for a living and all that and just move because we want to dig a hole and see if there's any giants." That's not going to happen. So there's a lot of reasons why you're not going to find uh, significant numbers of giant remains. And again, what are we looking for? People, between 6 and 7 feet tall. Like if you find that, have you found a giant, or is it just oh well, it's just an ordinary guy, a bit taller than average? I mean, what are we looking for? I would suggest that people are finding the giants, and they don't realize that they're finding them. And we actually had that in the case at Tel Es Safi, because a spokesman for the dig was asked, "Well, did you find giant remains? I mean, you're digging up the city of Goliath, the Philistine, right? I mean, we want to see giants." His response was, "Well, let's just say that we didn't find anyone taller than your average NBA center, right? Remember what I said? That's 6'9". That's exactly what the Septuagint says. That's the earliest textual witness to the biblical Goliath is actually that size." And he's saying, "Well, we didn't find anyone bigger than that." Now, he's not going to come out and say, "Yes, we found giants," because that would just discredit his entire operation, right? He doesn't want to be seen as a loony coming out and going, "Yeah, we found these crazy supernatural beings." Like, he's not going to do that. He's going to get defunded, right? So he comes out and says, "Well, we didn't find anyone, taller than an NBA center." Well, this is ancient Palestine. Everyone's 5'3". That's a big deal, right? So, yeah, are they finding these people? I think they are, but do they know what they're finding? That's another thing. Um, so, yeah, there's so many reasons why we're not going to find tons of specimens, and also reasons why when we find them, we may not know what we're looking at. So, what about the cover up? The giant bones and the Smithsonian and all this. Well, I couldn't say there hasn't been a cover up, because I mean, we don't know what we don't know. We can't see what is hidden, right? It wouldn't take much to hide a small handful of remains, if any have been found. Um, but I reckon, they're hiding in plain sight. Um, the giants did exist. They are being found, but our modern standards don't recognise them for what they are. And you know, seeing your average NBA center walking around ancient Palestine would have been a phenomenal sight, not an average thing like we see it now. Like, we have a different frame of reference. There's a lot of tall people getting around these days. I'm not saying they're Nephilim. That's our human development. That's what we consider normal in our culture. Well, yeah, I mean, you go to other places in the world and everybody's short, right? I mean, if you've been to Southeast Asia, a lot of people are similar size. 5'3", 5'6". And then you've got tribes in Africa where everybody's over 7 feet. So there's a lot of variations. And that doesn't mean they're all like, superhuman, semi-divine warriors. We just got to be reasonable about this. Um, but the I guess the real cover up here is that we should be expecting to see these, giant, 60-foot creatures and finding those remains. The real cover up is that while we expect to find those things, while we expect to see the biblical text abused and taken far too literally, and an ignorance of poetic genre and the general forms of human communication. As long as we expect to see that, we're going to miss the hard evidence that's right in front of us, right? Because we're not going to find 60 footers buried in the ground. Anyone says they have, they're misguided.
Are you
or they're
saying that
misguiding.
trolls are not real? Come on.
Well, we could maybe get into that another time. But yeah, it's just that kind of misinformation. I mean, it was popular in the in the 19th century to make these sensationalist claims in newspapers and stuff, right? I mean, that's what passed for entertainment back in the day. You put in a newspaper article that had these fantastic claims, and were often derived from ancient mythology. So the idea that people in the US had dug up these 8-foot skeletons, and they were suddenly nowhere to be seen. They're all gone. And again, show us. These are. This is just entertainment and fanciful literature. I mean, it'd be great to have the bones, wouldn't it? But we don't, and I don't think we can reasonably expect to. As I say, the evidence is there in the ground, and people are ignoring it because it's not sensational. It's not remarkable, at least in their eyes. I think looking at this through the biblical lens enables us to actually see what's there and to appreciate it for what it is. So yeah, hopefully that's a little bit of perspective on what we should be thinking about the remains of giants.
Yeah, thank you for that detailed answer. I will not reveal the identity of this Christian scholar and scientist whom I'm having next Sunday. One of the things I'll be talking with him, maybe not for too long, because I want to talk more about the UFOs and demonic stuff. But we'll also touch on, the identity of Nephilim. He also mentions in his work when he talks about the giants, uh, the modern athletes like NBA players, and then he comes up to a little bit different conclusion than you. But I don't want to spoil it. I don't want to reveal that's coming in next that's coming in 7 days, or yeah, next Sunday. So I hope you will see it, if not live, but it should be um Sunday 8. No, it will be Monday 8 a.m. Your time. If you
Mm.
cannot see it live, but you can see it whenever. I would like you to at least see that segment when he mentions NBA players and how the giants of old were still able to be mobile and to move fast, even though with all that armor and height. But I won't say
Mm.
more because I'll spoil it. Okay, so let's spend next 20 to 30 minutes in this few short. Well, I mean, they're short in the outline, but they're not short necessarily when it comes to discussing them. But these few short sections. First, how is whenever God would command in the Old Testament to his people, to the Israelites, whenever he will uh, command the total annihilation of a certain tribe, when he would when they would be quote unquote devoted to destruction to Yahweh, um, how is this related to the giants and the giant clans?
It's a good question. Yeah, and I think that's caused a lot of stumbling for people who sort of read it on the face of it, had a bit of a moral dilemma, and a lot of people have walked away from the faith because they perhaps,
I know of a person like that. I
yeah,
know,
just
unfortunately. So this is more of an apologetic subtopic that I would
mm,
like you to talk about You can take as much time as you have. But please give us the context of this. Was God really so mean that he would order even innocent children and animals to be killed for no reason because God was so insecure in himself? But what is the actual context of this? Whenever God would issue this command and the giant clans, how are they related?
Okay, so good questions. Firstly, when we read Joshua, for example, that's a military text, and it, in the ancient world, you had a particular literary type, like it's a kind of genre where these battles are described in particular terms, and they're not afraid to use a bit of exaggeration. They're not afraid to kind of round up the numbers and make themselves look good. That's part of normal literary convention in the ancient Near East when it comes to military narratives, right? So the first thing we've got to understand is when they say, oh, we slaughtered every man, woman, and child, that isn't necessarily what they meant on a strictly literal scientific level. Okay, but it's designed to convey this idea that it was a total victory, right? Like they totally won, uh, left no survivors, took no prisoners, showed no mercy. It was, our God's the best because this happened and we completely won and there's no question, right? So that's a part of what goes on in the language of the text, which we need to be aware of. But particularly when we get to that idea of being devoted to destruction or accursed, or however they want to say it, there's a bit of ambiguity there because the Hebrew term behind this actually comes in a couple of forms and can be a bit confusing. So you have the cherem, which is the uh, removal of objects from human use. Okay, so cherem applies when items are taken, say, in this context, the spoils of war devoted to God. Right, once you devote something to God, in terms of some physical item, whether it be silver and gold, or particular metals, things, the iron things they wanted to devote to God, they're basically removed from human use. Okay, so people aren't allowed to touch those things, have those things. The priests were given custody over those things, and they were to be used for divine purposes. The other application of cherem comes in the destruction of things um, that would be detrimental to people. So you have that in play when it comes to things like idols to foreign gods and stuff like that. Anything that had been devoted to the use of another god and that kind of thing. And it was designed to define that boundary between sacred space devoted to one god or the other. So you wanted to make sure that those things weren't allowed to interact because one's going to defile the other. And Yahweh, of course, wants to preserve the integrity of his land and his people. And so certain things were forbidden and had to be destroyed because they had these connections to other gods and um, could potentially defile God's people by leading them astray into the worship of foreign gods, which of course was going to be bad for them. So uh, items like that could be devoted to destruction. Again, that's cherem. But then we have a different term, which is charam. And there's just a little difference in vowels there. And of course, I mentioned it's consonantal text. They don't have vowels in there. So again, context is what informs the difference. Okay. So when we're looking at charam, we're now talking about the living. We're talking about people and animals, not just items and objects and things. And it's an important distinction to make because we don't treat them the same way. And although there's some overlap in the meaning and the rationale behind dealing with those things, it's important not to confuse them. Because, I mean, if you take a devoted thing to offer to God, and to devote to his service, you don't want to be using the same terminology to be talking about people that you slaughtered in battle, right? Because our God does not delight in sacrifice, especially not human sacrifice, right? So it's really important that we disambiguate there. But a lot of people, unfortunately, blur those lines because they're looking at the Hebrew root and they're not seeing the distinction which the context illuminates, right? So we've got to consider that carefully. Now, there's some biblical passages that kind of lay this out. You have to get to the Hebrew behind the text to see it, unfortunately, because the translations don't really help us much. But I'll read you quickly a couple of verses from Joshua chapter 6, verses 18 to 19. I've got the King James here. And ye in any wise keep yourselves from the accursed thing, that's cherem, lest ye make yourselves accursed, that's charam. When you take of the accursed thing, that's cherem, and make the camp of Israel a curse, again, cherem, and trouble it. But all the silver and gold and vessels of brass and iron are consecrated unto the Lord. They shall come in to the treasury of the Lord. So those things are dealt with differently to the people, okay, which the text in Hebrew makes clear, and unfortunately it's lost on us. So you remember the story of Achan, the guy who took some of the plunder from the conquest of Jericho, right? He took some of the devoted things and he was killed for that transgression. This passage explains how that works, right? Because when you take stuff that's meant to be for divine purpose, and you're a common man, you're not supposed to have those things. You've defiled sacred space, right? And God does not allow that to happen, particularly because it has a detrimental effect on the person. Okay, so that's the whole rationale that goes right back to Genesis 6 and the Nephilim, right? You shouldn't cross these earthly and divine boundaries, and that's what we saw in Genesis 6. That's what we see again in the rest of the Torah concerning the giant clans and that sort of thing. So that's the rationale behind the driving out of the Anakim, the giant clans. Unfortunately, most of them resisted being driven out and, in fact, turned around and fought against Israel, which is why they ended up falling in battle. Okay, so the original command was not go and slaughter them all. It was drive them out. And that eventually turned around to, well, if they're not going to leave, then they've chosen their fate. But they're considered to be an abomination, a mingling of divine and human that was done independently of God and against his will. And this is why they were singled out for destruction. All right. So, yeah, that's a big no-no because the Bible's very clear about not blurring those lines. Now, a lot of people are really confused about the idea of all that killing and stuff. How can you justify it? And it's important we get back to the idea of people being created in God's image, right? And specifically created to be or to bear God's image, right? So the purpose of people in God's original plan is that they embody him and they carry out his work on the earth. And that's really important because that assumption undergirds everything that we read in the conquest narrative. So people who have chosen allegiance to other gods and are allowing them to empower those people, and who are acting as the bodies of these lesser gods. Okay, and I'm talking not only the rebellious sons of God, but their sons, the Nephilim, and those spirits which are empowering these people through these rituals that we talked about earlier, right? They have transgressed those boundaries. They have chosen not to represent God, but to represent his enemies, right? This is what's going on here. And they've done it in a fashion that's irreversible, right? Because it's a flesh and blood um, connection that they've made through these rituals, and you can't pull yeast out of your bread, right? You've made the bread, you've baked it in, you can't separate those things out, and that's why they've got to go because they've basically effected a permanent corruption of God's image. He's not going to stand for that. So yeah, that's a big factor there, right? And I mentioned yeast in bread because you see that imagery again and again in Scripture, right? Remove all the leaven from your house, sweep the house clean. Don't let any yeast be found uh, in your house. And you have the yeast of the scribes and Pharisees. This idea that false teaching, which in the Second Temple period was associated with the fallen sons of God and the giants, um, false teaching and misrepresenting uh, the person of God was the primary sin that these divine and semi-divine beings were responsible for. Right, so all these ideas come together in this idea that uh, yeast kind of represents that intrinsic defilement of what God had made good, because you can't take it out again, right? So it's got to be destroyed. You can't have it. So that's what's going on in the conquest narrative. It is not a wholesale slaughter of every man, woman, and child, as we might be tempted to see it as on face value. But instead, we actually had God first extending some mercy in the sense that those people could be driven out. And really, I don't think God particularly cared where they went as long as they were not in his land, right? Because he'd chosen the promised land as the place where his name would dwell. So these semi-divine entities, these representatives of other gods, they can go somewhere else. But they wouldn't leave God's land, and they posed a very real threat and a danger. And that's the other thing. Um, we're talking military forces here, right? These giant clans had substantial fortifications and military encampments, and they were oppressing the indigenous populations. And it's something that we tend to gloss over. But I mean, you look at Rahab the prostitute in Jericho, right? She was quite happy to assist um, the Israelite spies to come in and to destroy and conquer Jericho, because she's subject to them, subjugated under them, just like the rest of the population, right? And she wants to be liberated. And that's the experience of the common person in the land, right? So they want to see these giant clans out as well, right? Because they're being oppressed and they're being subjugated. So yeah, it was really important that these people be driven out for the sake of the indigenous communities as well as the Israelites. And it's really important that we talk about that. There's no ethnic distinction, right? When we talk about the charam, because in that example that I gave you from Joshua 6, that's talking about Israelites, right? We're not talking about foreign people being slaughtered. That was Israelite people. You will corrupt and defile yourself if you touch these accursed things, so don't do it. It's not about ethnic cleansing. It's not about picking on other people groups and employing violence against them. It was never the purpose of what was going on there.
Thank you for that. I remember a while ago either reading or listening to the Christian book author and apologist Greg Koukl. I believe you heard about him, right? So I think it was him when he was defending the faith, so to speak, when it comes to this topic. And you mentioned, well, you gave a good expression of so-called ethnic cleansing. He said that this was basically, like you said, just a form of speech, like go and annihilate these people. If Israel literally would have done those things, then later when we read the Bible, we wouldn't see the same people or the same clans coming and still existing later. So for Greg and some other Christian apologists, like, well, no, this was it meant, like you said, like the total victory, but like it's not that 100% of certain clan was completely destroyed. That's not the case. So that's the first thing I wanted to say. And second thing, this could be just my assumption, better than me, but I think there must be a relation. Whenever God would say to his people, go and annihilate these people, go and devote them to destruction to me, I think, unless I'm wrong, that this will be mostly giant clans. So this comes to the corrupted image of God, to the corrupted DNA. God, I don't think that he sent his people to destroy just common, regular people, nation, ethnicity. I think that all of these clans that were destroyed, they had to do with the giants. And if this is true, I think this brings a very important, if not crucial, context. Why would God continue this spiritual warfare against this corrupted image of God and corrupted DNA? And then for me, that gives, if true, it gives perfect background as why would God go and send people to deal with these clans? Because they were not I can't say they were innocent in their sins, because none of us and our ancestors were innocent. But if they were truly a people of, descendants of giants, then it has to do something more spiritual and more corrupted, more wicked than just regular sinful people. Is this something that you would agree or not?
Yeah, absolutely. It's important actually to recognize that, because when you look at the nations outside of Israel, you can't say, well, they were guilty of breaking the law. The Israelite law doesn't apply to people outside of Israel, right? It just doesn't. I mean, you're speaking to me from America. I'm in Australia, right? I can't say to you, well, you don't follow Australian law, so you should fall under the weight of the uh, Australian legal system. Like, it doesn't apply. So there's got to be some other reason why these people were subject to judgment, right? And that means that we've got to come back to something that predates Jewish law. Okay, so then we get back to the Noahic covenant. Okay, Genesis 9, and the idea that whosoever sheds the blood of man, by man shall his blood be shed. And God actually says, I will demand an accounting from every beast for the blood of man. Okay, so non-human entities are subject to judgment at the hand of man for the killing and oppression of human beings. Okay, so when you realize that, you go, oh, that means that any person who has sacrificed their humanity by attempting to achieve divinity through these occultic rituals and whatnot, they've given up on what makes them human in order to try and achieve divinity, and they're now using it to oppress humans. The judgment of God is going to come upon them as per Genesis 9, and it's going to come at the hand of man, which is exactly what Joshua's people were doing. If you excuse me for a second, I'm just going to get rid of that background noise. Back in a moment. All right. Sorry about that. My children like to program the TV to turn on for programs that they're not going to be home to watch.
Oh, they're back from
Anyway,
the church.
no. They program the TV to just start automatically.
Okay, I
So
see.
nobody's home. I'm sitting here and it's all quiet, and then suddenly the TV turns on.
Oh,
Anyway,
that's spooky. And
yeah.
we're talking about giants and
Oh,
Rephaim and all these things.
yeah. Yeah. So anyway, I think it's really important that we keep that Noahic covenant in mind, because it really gives us a lot of explanatory power for what's going on in the conquest. And it's interesting too, on a different note, to look at the way that the overturning of civilization and the establishment of a new order gets described in ancient literature, because you have usually the idea of warfare and destruction on a grand scale gets talked about in terms of um, some great cataclysm, usually a flood. And it's very interesting that we have all this talk of violence in Genesis 6, and then we get a flood. We have people who survive by crossing over the water, Noah and his family, and the establishment of a new order that follows. Right? Then we get to the conquest narrative. We have people crossing the water. Then we have this violence, and then we have the establishment of new order as the Israelites settle into the land. So just some attention to ancient literary conventions helps us to see some of what's going on in terms of genre and what they're doing with those narratives.
Thank you, Tim. And the last section, I just want to bring a bit of New Testament into the whole this topic of Nephilim or giants. Probably the question that requires the longest period of time of answering, and it's up to you how much time you can dedicate to this. Is a very interesting topic of Jesus and the bulls of Bashan. How is Jesus connected to these bulls in Psalm 22? And are these real animals or perhaps spiritual entities?
Okay, so let's have a look at the psalm first. All right, so Psalm 22, verse 1. To the choir master, according to the doe of the dawn. So that's a note on the musical arrangement for this song, a psalm of David. So we've got David described there as the author, and of course he, as the king of Israel, enthroned, is sort of a precursor to Jesus, the greatest king of all. And he says, my God, why have you forsaken me? Why are you so far from saving me from the words of my groaning? And he goes on and on. But that first line is familiar to anyone who's read the story of the crucifixion, right? Because Jesus calls out these words. And why? Why does he say this? Well, firstly, Jesus is, he's not just divine. He's not just God. He's also a man, and he's suffering, and he's going through some hard times. And I think it's natural for anyone going through such intense pain and anguish to cry out in such a way. So I think we've got to feel for the humanity of Jesus, but he's also aware of things going on that we don't see, and that people on the ground at the crucifixion couldn't see. Okay, because he knows what's going on in the supernatural realm. It's as clear to him as, I'm looking at you now. And we come down to verse 12 of this psalm, which Jesus has quoted and therefore alluded to. And it says, many bulls encompass me, strong bulls of Bashan surround me. They open wide their mouths at me like a ravening and roaring lion. And it goes on. Dogs encompass me, a company of evildoers encircles me. They have pierced my hands and feet. And so it goes on. So this bulls of Bashan, well, you might remember I was talking about that inscription on Mount Hermon, right? The great bull was mentioned in that text. In just looking for that quote now, because I don't want to misquote. According to the command of the great bull god Batios, which is derived from Bashan. Okay, because in Canaanite that's Batan. Okay, and the Greeks have gone Batios from the Canaanite. Right, those swearing an oath in this place go forth. So this ties right back, and of course Jesus is not ignorant of the Enochic tradition or the rest too. He knows that stuff. In fact, he calls First Enoch scripture in other places. So he knows about this stuff. The cultural connections are not lost on his audience, right? So he quotes Psalm 22. The context, afforded by that psalm enables him to communicate something about what he sees in the unseen realm going on at the time of his crucifixion. And what he's saying is that these demons, these unclean spirits, the fallen sons of God, if you like, or shall we say the rebellious sons of God, because they didn't really fall, did they? They are mocking Jesus at this time. They are gloating. They think they've won. They're surrounding him, taunting him. They're reveling in this situation where they've got him on the ropes. Jesus is nailed to a cross. They've got the only begotten Son of God about to die, and of course they don't realize that Jesus is going to overcome death, and he's going to snatch the keys of death from them. So it's a really significant passage where Jesus quotes that psalm, particularly if you see the background and if you're aware of the culture that informs all of that, which Jesus was clearly aware of and was communicating very subtly there. But it puts an extra dimension on the crucifixion as we consider it.
Yeah, and maybe a sub question of this question is how does this help us to understand the Old Testament giants in a better light when it comes to Jesus quoting Psalm 22, being surrounded by the spiritual entities which he called as the bulls of Bashan? How can we correlate this with Nephilim?
Yeah, so the Nephilim, as we've established, were the original product of the rebellious sons of God interfering with human women and producing these giant offspring, which terrorized the pre-flood world in terms of their violence and their subjugation of humanity to the point of almost extinction, were it not for Noah and his family. Once again, in the post-flood world, we have people accessing those spirits and using them to gain power to, again, oppress and subjugate people and to bring them under their dominion for their own benefit, which is, again, why the conquest was necessary to free the indigenous people of Canaan from the oppression and the tyranny and the violence of the giant clans. Right, this is going on again and again, over and over. It just keeps coming up, and the progress through the Bible is a very slow, gradual process of taking that element of chaos and disorder and opposition to God and progressively eliminating it over time. So first we have the original Nephilim, the giants drowned in the flood. The spirits come back, they start empowering people, and those people are wiped out. Then we're left with the demons, who again are disembodied spirits. They can afflict people and they cause all sorts of problems for them, as the Gospels make clear. And we see Jesus casting them out, particularly with the story of Legion is significant because he is in the region of the Gerasenes, which is where the Girgashite clan ended up when they fled, because the only one of the clans of the Anakim that actually did what they were supposed to do and fled from before Joshua and his army was the clan of the Girgashites. And they end up in this place, which is later called the land of the Gerasenes, which is, transliteration of the same sort of thing. And all these demons are there, right? Because the giants have long since died, and the spirits are still there, and they turn up in this guy named Legion. And so along comes Jesus, and as I say in my book, he is the solution to the giant question, and he is able to set this man free and cast them out. So we see this progressive elimination of cosmic evil from the world through people uh, acting as the body of God by maintaining allegiance to Him and doing His works. Okay, we saw it in Joshua, we see it again in Jesus, of course, fully in Jesus, but there's still more work to be done, and that's where the church comes in, right? And anyone faithful to Yahweh falls within that group of people who are able to act as God's body on earth to continue this work of driving out evil and reclaiming the world as as our place of residence, uh, for God, and dedicating that sacred space back to Him. So this is what we see happening throughout, and that comes into the disciples that Jesus sends out. Luke chapter 10, He sends out the 70 disciples. Why are there 70? Well, because we had 70 nations back at Babel, right? Remember, all this uh, proliferated through the world because of the Babel event. And a lot of people would be unfamiliar with that because it just sounds like a story about the origin of languages. That's the way people talk about it these days. I would argue that the story is actually about the proliferation of idolatry in terms of this the cult of the Rephaim, and spreading this idea of people becoming gods by assuming the power of the Nephilim, which was then dispersed through the nations, and why all these nations had these divinized kings and that sort of thing. So the idea of sending out 70 disciples is about directly tackling that and taking back the world under allegiance to Yahweh.
It's such a pleasure to listen to you. Just so much knowledge comes from this decade of research. I truly enjoy. And you went ahead and answered some of the questions I was about to ask. So I just have the last question in this topic for tonight. When it comes to our identity as the new sons of God, right? Because in the Old Testament, that term or title, sons of God, was primarily reserved for the angelic beings. So now in the new covenant, because of Jesus, we have this identity that we are the sons of God. Uh, Having that identity and being commanded by Jesus to do the water baptism as one of the couple of sacraments which he gave to the church to obey. Water baptism is a symbol of the removal of the old rebellion. You say on page 409, and you are cross-referencing this with the flood. How is this related to us as the sons of God, having new identity, being obedient in this sacramental water baptism? How is this removing of the old rebellion? And how is this encouraging to us when we see the Old Testament, the fallen ones, and for them the water being a symbol of destruction, but for us being a symbol of renewal and adoption into the family of God?
Yeah. Okay. So I mentioned a little while ago the idea of the connection between floodwaters and warfare. and the way that those images get combined in ancient literature. So the idea is that a new order comes about as a result of the total destruction and devastation of what was there before. Right, so the flood water comes, everything is destroyed, and then the new order emerges, and it's a whole new way of living in the world that comes about as a result of that. Right, so we see that in the flood. We see it again in the conquest. You have a water crossing, you have this military um, exercise, and then the new civilization that is established in faithfulness to Yahweh. Right, so this happens again and again, and there's always the connection between the water and the battle and the new order that follows. Right, so we're talking about recreation. So when you have uh, people faithful to Yahweh described as a new creation, right? What we're talking about is a new way of living, the destruction of the old self, the reordering of life around a new central paradigm, which is the Lord Jesus Christ and devotion to our Heavenly Father. That's a whole new way of life, right? And it's a declaration of war that is won against the powers of darkness that once held sway in our lives, right? So water baptism is recreation, it is victory over evil, and it's a fresh new start with a different way of life. And I think that's just absolutely beautiful. You see that throughout, particularly in Peter's letters. Keeping that insight in mind really is quite illuminating when you read those letters. It's yeah, a great way to look at it.
Tim, it's been truly a pleasure. You're like a walking encyclopedia when it comes to all these topics. I hope you'll continue writing books, not just working on your podcast, but also writing books so I can have uh, more excuses to bring you on the channel, right? Because I don't want this to stop. I would like this to be occasional, ongoing thing. Um, Thank you so much for sacrificing your time. I know we went longer than 2 hours. But I'm also not sorry because we learned so much from you tonight. I'm so thankful. And just for the end, where can the audience find you? Let's say some people who plugged in, watching this, never heard about you. Can you please tell us about your blog, your website, and your podcast, anything that you're working on?
Yeah, sure. So everything comes through my website, giantanswers.com. And from there, you can link to Amazon to get my book, Answers to Giant Questions. You can also tune into the podcast. You don't need to go through the website for that. If you've got a podcast player app on your device, you can find the Answers to Giant Questions podcast, um, which at present we're in the lead up to Genesis 6. So some really exciting stuff about to drop there. So it's a good time to subscribe to the podcast. Um, there's a lot going on. But again, giantanswers.com is the home of all the stuff that I do. So find me there. You can find me on social media as well. You can follow my author page, TJ Steadman. And yeah, that's pretty much it. And you'll find me on the socials, but again, everything directs back to the website, giantanswers.com. So that's the place to go. Grab yourself a copy of the book from Amazon and have a read. And yeah, hopefully you find the podcast is interesting as well. That's going to feed into my next book, which will be uh, based around the primeval history as the interpretive key for getting a handle on scripture and using that to inform our biblical worldview.
Okay, I didn't know you're preparing another book. I just said there's a wishful
Mm,
thought, but I guess
there you
there's
go.
something about it. Okay, I'm excited about it. Please keep us posted about your work. Do you plan to publish book maybe next year?
Oh, I think it'll be a while away yet. Yeah, I've got plenty of work ahead of me before I will have anything to publish. But in the meantime, the podcast is a good resource, and of course, you've got the book for reference material as well. So yeah, there's still a bit going on. I'm very busy, and I have a regular full time job. I don't get paid to study these things. I do it in my spare time. So yeah, I'm kind of stretched a bit thin, but I've got these things on the horizon. I'm chipping away slowly. We'll get there. And yeah, I can't wait to have a new book to release. But yeah, that'll be a while away yet.
Tim, thank you so much for your time and for being willing to dedicate well, not just time, but also your energy, time from family, from work, from not just full time job, but to all this work you're doing for a podcast and sharing all this information with us. It's been truly a blessing. I wish you a blessed new, a blessed Sunday because I know it's Sunday morning in Australia. Blessed new week, and I'm looking forward in next episode where we'll be talking about more nerdy things. So thank you
Yeah,
once again for everything and God bless.
absolutely. Well, thank you very much for having me on the show. Really enjoyed it again, and yeah, would love to do it again. So yeah, thanks to all the everyone watching out there, watching and listening, and yeah, be sure to stay tuned for next time. Looking forward to it.
Thank you. Take care.